it is May 20th, Tuesday, May 20th, 2025. Unbelievable. So it is, and coming to you live from northern Israel with an update about what's going on in the Israel Hamas war in Gaza and Operation Gideon's Chariots. Um, how do we say this? Okay, well, this operation began in earnest a couple nights ago. Hi, how are you? Um, began in earnest a couple of nights ago when the deadline for the offer that was made by the Israeli government to the Hamas uh, had expired. That offer was basically release the hostages and surrender, and we won't proceed with the operation, obviously, because the reason for an immediate fighting would end. But they did not, of course, and so Israel had to do what it said it would do. And they also had said that they would wait for President Trump to leave the Middle East before they began their operation. Interesting to note that last week, when President Trump was in the Middle East, well, literally while he was giving a speech in Saudi Arabia about how great his achievement was with the Houthis of Yemen, which wasn't really a great achievement, but whatever, we can call it that. I mean, it was okay. They're shipping again in the Red Sea, and that's good, but the Houthis continue to attack Israel. And in fact, they've attacked Israel multiple times since then, as they said they would. Um, and the U.S., whatever. So while he's sitting there congratulating himself in Saudi Arabia for the amazing achievement of telling the Houthis, hey, let's stop fighting. And the Houthis said, okay. Which, okay, good. I'm all for more peace. But the Houthis are still fighting Israel, and America has interests in Israel beyond just military hardware, which there is a little bit of. But there's a lot of Americans living in Israel who contribute a lot to the Israeli economy and to the American economy in what they do at work, both in government jobs, but also in private sector jobs, especially in tech and medicine and science and research, right? And the law and culture, etc., etc. Um, but the point is, while he's sitting there or standing there in Saudi Arabia, literally as he's giving a speech about how he's bringing peace to the region, like during those words, no less, the Houthis fired a rocket that went quite literally like over the skies of the country he was in, right over his head, basically. Fired a rocket that went over the head of the president of the United States towards Israel, which Israel managed to successfully intercept with its air defense system. Um, that should tell you kind of everything you need to know right there about the state of affairs in the Middle East. It's not a place for the faint of heart, right? It's a tough place in many ways, even in the relatively peaceful times and areas. Right, so yeah, we have great air defense systems in Israel, but even so, they're not 100%. You know, maybe 4%, maybe 10% of the rockets, depending on what system, might get through. It's a lot of rockets, and there are thousands and thousands of rockets being fired at you every year from all kinds of different directions and all kinds of different threat sources. And the Houthis have not shot just a tiny handful, right? They've shot hundreds of rockets at this point in Israel in just the past year, and the rockets they're firing, they're not like little, you know, um, they're not the same kind of pipe bomb rockets that the Hamas typically fires, which are still deadly and cannot be taken lightly. Not a joke. But typically, the rockets that Hamas fires out of Gaza, obviously, they're much shorter range and they're much smaller and lighter, so they do less damage potentially. But still, they are a very dangerous and lethal threat, and that's why Israel has developed the Iron Dome system against it. But the rockets that the Houthis fire at us typically are much more significant. They actually shoot like intercontinental ballistic missiles at us, which have significant punch packed in for obvious reasons. Let's see, I see emojis here. Hello, emojis. So in any case, let's not get sidetracked by the Houthis. Operation Gideon's Chariots in Gaza right now is underway since 2 nights. Israel has been preparing this operation for weeks. You have to remember that the height of the initial stages of this conflict, like after that started on October 7th, of course, yes, I know the overall conflict goes back many more years, but the hot phase of this conflict that started October 7th, 2023, when Hamas invaded Israel with their friends and collaborators, the PIJ and other groups that joined them, and also a whole bunch of random citizens, or not citizens, just random people, if you will, of Gaza, right? Who just crossed the border. Not officially combatants, just people who wanted to go do violence, right? Because they knew there was bounty, they knew there was reward for every person they harmed or killed or captured, and every piece of property they destroyed, on videotape or whatever. So they knew that they'd get paid to go and do damage to Israel, basically. Thousands and thousands of people broke across the lines, and the border between Gaza and Israel to go and do harm to Israel. And at the height of the early stages of that conflict, once Israel started to respond militarily, which was, by the way, 2 weeks later, right? Yes, because the first few days, Israel was just first getting rid of whoever was left inside Israel trying to do more harm. Literally, like on the 7th, 8th, and 9th, right? They were just mopping up, if you will, anybody that was left inside Israel that had not yet escaped back to Gaza. So they were, fighting against terrorists all over the place, in fields, in little towns, everywhere that they could find them. And by the end of that count, 1,000 or so terrorists had been eliminated inside of Israel proper, and Israel had not yet fired one shot in Gaza in retaliation, not one. And it waited and weighed its options, and it gave the Hamas plenty of time to decide to end the war, bring the hostages home, and prevent decimation of the Gaza Strip and the active pursuit of the end of the Hamas. The Hamas refused. Israel built up its reserve forces and its active forces on the border. Took its sweet old time. And rather than sending in a lightning fast response that might be less prepared, got extremely well prepared. Of course, it suffered it suffered casualties, dead soldiers. And over the past year and a half, there have been more than a few hundred soldiers have died in combat in Gaza. So it's not a light task. Certainly not risk-free, but it could have been a lot worse had Israel rushed in a rash response rather than a very carefully crafted response. And they sent in around 30 to 40,000 troops in the initial months of that war. 30 to 40,000. And those 30, 40,000 have been recycling through Gaza for the past year and a half. Right? That's in addition to the tens of thousands that were sent up to fight on the border with Lebanon, and in South Lebanon during the few months that Israel was actually active in South Lebanon. Now, yes, they still have 5 little outposts. When they say outposts, they really mean like tiny, tiny little bases. They're not even permanent, really, bases. They're just you know, 5 places where there are some soldiers keeping some jeeps and some armored, probably some armor, some tanks or whatever, and some infantry soldiers in like right on the border in South Lebanon, and they're doing that to keep the Hezbollah away from the border in South Lebanon. That's why they're there, and Israel has no intention of staying there permanently. And once the Hezbollah actually does what it said it would do, which is to pull back beyond the Litani River and not to have any arsenal left south of the Litani River, and once it does not attack Israel from anywhere, whether it's south of the Litani River or not, then Israel has, will just leave South Lebanon as it has done before, multiple times, because it has no interest in conquering South Lebanon, not even, a tiny outpost of it. There's no interest there. Okay? No, it's not. It's not Israel, and Israelis don't want it. Right? We want peace with our neighbor Lebanon, and that means getting rid of Hezbollah, because Hezbollah is currently the reason that Lebanon remains in a conflict with Israel. You get rid of Hezbollah, and you get rid of the Islamist influence, right, that ruined Lebanon after the PLO had ruined it, right? So the socialist, Marxist, PLO had ruined that country after their invasion in the late 70s, and killed many thousands of Lebanese Muslims as well as Christians, by the way. After they ruined it, when they got chased out by Israel, and Arafat had to flee to Tunis in Tunisia, then the Hezbollah very quickly filled the void, because Lebanon had already been in a civil war. So they just came in and were like, hey, we're going to join this fight. So Iran basically funded this proxy group, right? Funded a bunch of Shias, many of whom were from Iran, and many of whom were obviously Shia Muslims who followed the Iranian imams or whatever, Ayatollahs, and they wanted to have Shia Islam take over Lebanon. And very quickly, they emerged as the leading terrorist organization in the world in terms of size and arms, and money and influence. To this day, they run massive illegal car operations where they, they steal cars, they resell them at a higher price, or they buy stolen cars, resell them at a much higher price. They have chop shops all over South America for cars. It's a very organized crime organization, terrorist organization. Anyway, so Israel obviously decimated the Hezbollah in Lebanon last year, but they still exist, and they're still relatively powerful. Yes, they may not have the same delivery systems intact like they had 6 months ago or a year ago, and they may have lost their so-called charismatic leader, Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, and they may have lost 5,000 or so of their fighters in the famous pager bombing scenario, and beeper bombings or whatever. But they still exist, and they're still a very dangerous force. That's why Israel maintains 5 outposts in South Lebanon. Anyway, it took however many soldiers Israel sent to Lebanon and to that border to deal with that. Not 30 or 40,000 like we sent to Gaza, but, thousands for sure. And so, again, at the height of the fighting, a year and a half ago, at the initial stages of the invasion of Gaza, when they were, really pushing hard to gain control of Gaza, etc., of large swaths of it, there were 30 to 40,000 Israeli soldiers in Gaza. Now, for this push, at which point most of the Hamas has been, the senior leadership obviously has been wiped out, and now they're like on the D list of senior leaders, you know, people who never would have made it close to the top of the organization. They're suddenly finding themselves in senior commander roles because their predecessors have all been eliminated. Now, those that remain there and that remain, in control of the Gaza Strip, they're facing a force coming to them from Israel, and the Israelis have sent in, or they've called up anyway, something like 60 to 70,000 just reservists. Doesn't even include the active soldier forces, the active duty forces. Right? Now you may think to yourself, well, reservists, what do? They're just reservists. They're just they're not doing much. Well, no, actually, in Israel, they actually do. Because here, people serve in reserves for many, many years, usually until they're 50 or 55 years old in a lot of cases. Or at least 40 to 45 in most cases. And that includes combatants, infantry and aviators and everything else. So why does it matter? Well, it matters because people who are in the army a few years are in active duty. Yes, they're very intensely in active duty. They're very sharp and on their thing. And, once they pass that first few months of early experience, and certainly once they've seen real combat, they become, very professional very quickly. But of course, if you've served and you've already retired out of the army, and you come back just for reserve duty every year, well, when you're coming back for 1 to 2 months a year, that's not a negligible amount of time. It's roughly 10% of your year that you're spending in the army, even when you're not in an active duty role. Still very well trained overall over the course of the year. Now, of course, it means you're fall out of practice with, and that is why the army routinely makes the reserve duty soldiers practice. Right? I mean, literally, they have, suddenly being tested, So, fighting force is young and relatively inexperienced compared to our reserve duty forces that serve for many years. In any case, the point is, when you call up 60 to 70,000 reserve duty soldiers in Israel, that is a big deal because they are very capable. And that's a lot of reserve duty soldiers to call up for any fight in Israel. We don't usually require that many soldiers for anything because they are very competent and very well equipped and very well trained. And we can send in far smaller amounts of soldiers to do immense and extremely complicated tasks.